A woman in a faded gray blazer walked toward the gate reserved for private jets, her leather bag slung over one shoulder, her flat shoes scuffed from travel. Behind the glass, the aircraft bearing her own company's insignia waited on the tarmac, engines silent, ready for her signature to send it into the sky. But instead of being welcomed, she was stopped in front of dozens of watching passengers. A gate agent laughed under her breath and said a woman like her could not possibly own a jet worth tens of millions of dollars. When security was called to escort her away, nobody in that terminal knew that by 4 o'clock that same afternoon, a boardroom meeting would hand this exact woman the authority to decide the fate of the entire airport. The private terminal at Ashford International hummed with quiet privilege that morning, the kind of hush reserved for people who never had to check a departure board because someone else always checked it for them. Marble floors reflected the soft golden light pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows, and somewhere beyond the glass, a dozen private aircraft sat gleaming on the tarmac like sleeping animals waiting to be woken. Naomi Carter walked through the automatic doors with the tired gait of someone who had spent the last 18 hours inspecting runway infrastructure in another city. Her blazer wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a simple knot, her face free of the polish she wore for cameras and shareholders. She had learned long ago that comfort mattered more than appearance when nobody was supposed to be watching, and today, of all days, she wanted to walk through her own investment as an ordinary traveler, unnoticed and unbothered, so she could feel what her employees felt every single day. She had flown into countless terminals over the years, some grand and gleaming, others small and utilitarian, and she had developed a quiet habit of studying each one the way an engineer studies a bridge, looking past the polished surfaces to the systems humming underneath, the staffing patterns, the wait times, the small human interactions that revealed far more about an operation than any glossy annual report ever could. Ashford International had impressed her on paper for months, its financial statements steady, its location strategically valuable, its infrastructure aging but salvageable, and today marked the final piece of due diligence, before she allowed her signature to close a deal that would reshape the airport's future for decades to come. She approached the gate, marked for departures on private charter, where a Gulfstream jet sat waiting under her company's own tail number, fueled and ready for the short hop that would take her to the final site inspection before the afternoon's board meeting. She reached into her bag and produced her flight authorization, a clean document bearing her name, her company seal, and the aircraft registration that matched the jet outside the window. Lisa Monroe, the gate agent on duty, barely glanced at the paper before her eyes narrowed with something between suspicion and amusement. She turned the document over once, as if searching for a watermark that would prove it fake, then handed it back with a tight, condescending smile, informing Naomi that private jet documentation required additional verification and that walk-up passengers without proper credentials were not permitted past this point. Naomi kept her voice level, explaining that she was listed as the registered account holder for the aircraft and that a phone call to the flight operations desk would confirm everything in under a minute. Lisa's smile only widened, the kind of expression people wear when they believe they have caught someone in a lie, and she said, loudly enough for the surrounding travelers to hear, that she doubted very much a woman dressed like that could be the owner of a $50 million jet. A ripple of attention moved through the seating area, well-dressed executives glancing up from their tablets and phones, some smirking, others simply watching with the detached curiosity of people who assumed the scene would resolve itself in their favor. Nobody offered to help. Nobody suggested checking the system. They simply watched a woman being humiliated and decided it was someone else's problem. A young couple near the seating area lowered their magazines to watch, whispering to each other with poorly concealed curiosity, while an older gentleman in a cashmere sweater simply shook his head and returned to his newspaper, apparently satisfied that the situation was none of his concern. Lisa straightened her uniform jacket, visibly pleased with the small audience gathering around her, and repeated her request for Naomi to step aside so that other passengers, real passengers as she put it, could proceed through the gate without delay. Daniel Brooks, the head of terminal security, arrived within minutes, summoned by a radio call from Lisa that described an unauthorized individual attempting to board a private aircraft under false pretenses. He was a broad-shouldered man, with 22 years on the job, and a reputation for trusting his instincts over any piece of paper. And his instincts, shaped by decades of assumptions he had never bothered to question, told him everything he needed to know the moment he saw Naomi standing quietly at the counter. He asked her to step away from the boarding area, his tone clipped and final, the tone of a man who believed courtesy was a reward reserved for people who had already proven themselves worthy of it. Naomi did not raise her voice. She simply repeated that the aircraft belonged to her company and that a single phone call would settle the matter, but Daniel had already made his decision. And men like Daniel rarely reversed course once their minds were set on a version of events that felt familiar. Outside on the tarmac, the pilot of the Gulfstream noticed the commotion through the terminal glass and made his way toward the gate, his uniform crisp, his expression puzzled, because he had been expecting Miss Carter for the last 20 minutes and had assumed some delay in ground transportation was the cause. He pushed through the door just as Daniel motioned for 2 additional officers to approach, and for one brief moment, the pilot opened his mouth to explain who exactly he was waiting for. But Daniel, certain he was witnessing a scam unfold in real time, cut him off before a single word could leave his lips, and ordered the officers to remove the woman from the private terminal immediately. A woman near the coffee kiosk leaned over to her companion and murmured that she had read stories about people trying to sneak onto private jets by claiming false ownership, and her companion nodded knowingly, as if the two of them had just confirmed a piece of common wisdom, rather than repeated an unverified assumption. The crowd shifted closer, phones rising instinctively to capture the spectacle, the way crowds always do when they sense a story unfolding in front of them. A man in an expensive suit chuckled to his colleague and murmured that airports saw this kind of thing more often than people realized, con artists dressing the part and hoping nobody would check the details. Lisa nodded along, arms crossed, satisfied with her own judgment, and declared for anyone still listening that her team encountered impersonators like this nearly every single week, people who thought a confident tone and a forged document could buy them access to a world they didn't belong in. Daniel ordered the gate system locked, revoking any pending boarding credentials associated with the tail number, a bureaucratic reflex meant to protect the airport from liability, though in truth, it protected nothing except his own certainty. Naomi remained still through all of it, her hands folded in front of her, her expression unreadable to anyone who did not know her well enough to see the calm calculation behind her eyes. She was not angry, not visibly, though something in her had gone quiet and sharp the way it always did when she watched a system fail exactly the way she had spent her career trying to fix. She asked one simple question, her voice even and measured, wondering aloud whether anyone present had actually verified the registered ownership of the aircraft against the airport's own database before deciding to escalate the situation to a physical removal. Nobody answered. Nobody moved to check. The pilot tried once more to explain the situation, raising his hand slightly as if requesting permission to speak, but Daniel interrupted again, telling him flatly that con artists sometimes worked with accomplices and that his cooperation would be noted for the incident report. Naomi was guided away from the boarding area by 2 officers, her bag still slung over her shoulder, her flight authorization crumpled slightly in Lisa's dismissive hand, and the small crowd watched her go with the quiet satisfaction of people who believed order had been restored. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice or demand an apology in front of the cameras now recording her from a dozen angles. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, a teenager filming on his phone lowered the device slightly, uncertain now whether what he was capturing was justice being served or something closer to cruelty, though he said nothing and kept recording anyway. Instead, once she reached the edge of the terminal, she stepped calmly to the side, pulled her phone from her bag, and placed a single call, her voice low enough that only the person on the other end could hear what she said next. She gave no instructions to intervene, no demand that anyone be fired or reprimanded on the spot. She simply confirmed a name, a time, and an address, and ended the call before anyone nearby noticed she had made it at all. Nobody standing in that terminal that morning had any idea who Naomi Carter truly was, because she had built her entire empire on being underestimated and had learned, over 2 decades, to let that underestimation work in her favor rather than against her. She was the founder and majority owner of Carter Meridian Group, a logistics and aviation infrastructure company that had quietly become one of the most influential private investors in airport development across the country, owning dozens of aircraft, managing cargo networks that spanned 4 continents, and holding stakes in transportation hubs that most travelers would never think twice about. She had started with a single leased cargo plane at the age of 26, flying overnight freight routes nobody else wanted, and had built that single aircraft into a fleet through relentless discipline and an almost obsessive attention to the smallest operational details, the kind of details most executives delegated to someone else and never thought about again. She remembered those early years vividly, the nights spent sleeping on cots in maintenance hangars because a hotel room would have eaten into the fuel budget, the mornings spent negotiating with skeptical clients who doubted a young woman could keep a delivery schedule that veteran companies routinely missed. She had proven herself not through grand gestures, but through consistency, through showing up on time every single time, until reputation caught up with capability, and through the decades that followed, she had never forgotten how it felt to be doubted before anyone bothered to ask a single question. That memory had shaped the culture of Carter Meridian Group from its earliest days, a company built on the belief that competence should be verified through evidence rather than assumed or dismissed based on appearance, a philosophy she now carried into every acquisition her company pursued. Colleagues who had worked alongside her for years often remarked that she treated every acquisition the way a doctor treated a diagnosis, refusing to trust a chart or a summary until she had examined the patient herself, walked the hallways, spoken with the staff, and watched how a place actually functioned when its leadership assumed nobody important was paying attention. It was this habit, more than any spreadsheet or financial projection, that had made Carter Meridian Group one of the most trusted names in infrastructure investment, because Naomi's instincts for identifying dysfunction inside an organization had proven, again and again, more reliable than any outside audit. Today's visit to Ashford International had nothing to do with luxury travel and everything to do with due diligence. Her company had spent the last 8 months quietly negotiating the acquisition of a struggling regional airport chain, and Ashford sat at the center of that portfolio, the crown asset, in a deal that would close within hours if the final terms were approved. Naomi had insisted on conducting this last site visit herself, dressed exactly as she had been dressed, moving through the terminal exactly as an ordinary passenger would, because she did not trust glossy tours arranged by nervous executives eager to impress her. She wanted to see how the airport treated people when nobody in a position of power was supposedly watching, and in the cruelest possible irony, she had gotten exactly the demonstration she came looking for. Across town, in a glass-walled boardroom 40 floors above the city, Helen Morris sat at the head of a long table, checking her watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. She was the chairperson of Halcyon Capital, the investment fund that held majority ownership of Ashford International, and she had scheduled this afternoon's meeting specifically to finalize the sale of the airport to Carter Meridian Group, a deal that would rescue Halcyon from years of declining returns and mounting maintenance costs the fund could no longer justify. Richard Evans, the airport's chief executive officer, sat 2 seats down, rehearsing the closing remarks he had prepared for months, certain that today would mark the beginning of a new chapter for the struggling facility he had spent a decade trying to modernize with insufficient resources and an increasingly disengaged board. He had personally overseen the preparation of every document in the thick binder resting on the table in front of him, cross-checking projections late into the night, determined that nothing about this presentation would give Naomi Carter any reason to hesitate or walk away from a deal that represented, in his private estimation, the only realistic path forward for an airport whose revenues had stagnated for 3 consecutive years. Helen's assistant stepped quietly into the room and leaned down to whisper something in her ear, and the chairperson's expression shifted from mild impatience to genuine concern. She looked up at Richard, her voice carrying just enough tension to silence the room instantly, informing him that Naomi Carter had not yet arrived at the terminal and that nobody on the ground team had confirmed her location in nearly 40 minutes. Richard felt a small knot form in his stomach as he reached for his phone, dialing the terminal operations desk directly instead of routing through his usual assistant, because something in Helen's tone told him this was not a moment for delegation. The line rang twice before a flustered supervisor picked up, stammering through an explanation that made no sense at first. Something about an unauthorized individual attempting to board a private aircraft and being removed by security. Richard asked, more sharply than he intended, for a name, and when the supervisor read back the details from the incident report, the color drained slowly from his face as he recognized the flight authorization number listed as fraudulent, a number that matched exactly the aircraft scheduled to carry Naomi Carter to this very meeting. He requested the terminal's security footage be pulled immediately, his hands trembling slightly as he connected to the live feed on his laptop, and there she was, unmistakable even in low resolution, standing calmly at the gate counter, while a gate agent waved a document dismissively, and a security officer motioned for her removal. Richard stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in his chest, because he understood immediately what this meant and how catastrophically his own staff had misjudged the situation. Helen rose from her seat as well, her earlier impatience replaced entirely by alarm, asking Richard in a low voice whether the deal itself might now be in jeopardy, whether months of careful negotiation could collapse because of a single morning's carelessness on the ground floor. Richard had no answer for her, only a growing certainty that whatever had happened at that gate represented a failure far larger than a simple misunderstanding, the kind of failure that could not be smoothed over with a polite phone call or a fruit basket sent to a hotel room. He stood so fast his chair rolled backward into the wall, muttering an apology to Helen that he barely had time to finish before he was already moving toward the door, his phone pressed to his ear as he called for a car to take him to the terminal himself. The drive from the corporate tower to the terminal normally took closer to 20 minutes, but Richard's driver, sensing the urgency in his voice, cut through side streets and delivery lanes, weaving past slower traffic, while Richard sat rigid in the back seat, replaying the security footage in his mind and rehearsing an apology he suspected would never feel adequate, no matter how carefully he worded it. He arrived at the private gate 11 minutes later, breathless, his tie loosened from the run through the parking structure, to find Naomi standing quietly near the terminal entrance, exactly where the officers had left her, her expression calm, despite everything that had just happened. Lisa was still nearby, arms crossed, still convinced of her own correctness. And when she caught sight of Richard approaching at a near sprint, she offered a small, confused smile. Assuming he had come to commend her vigilance, Daniel stood a few feet away, reviewing the incident report on a tablet, muttering to a colleague that he would stand by every decision he had made that morning, regardless of who eventually complained about it. Richard reached Naomi first, extending both hands in an apology so immediate and so complete that Lisa's smile faltered before he had even finished his first sentence. He introduced her properly to the small crowd still lingering nearby, his voice carrying clearly across the terminal as he explained that this was Naomi Carter, founder of Carter Meridian Group, and the woman scheduled to finalize the acquisition of this very airport within hours. Lisa's face went white. Daniel's jaw tightened, though he still did not fully believe what he was hearing. Some stubborn part of him searching for a reason, this could still be a misunderstanding in his favor. Naomi accepted Richard's apology with a small, tired smile, telling him gently that placing blame in a public hallway would accomplish nothing useful, and that her only request was that the board meeting proceed exactly on schedule, without delay and without special treatment on her account. Richard walked beside her toward the car waiting outside, still apologizing under his breath, still trying to piece together an explanation his staff could offer that would make any of this sound less indefensible. It was somewhere in that short walk, watching Naomi's calm and unreadable expression, that a new and unsettling thought crossed his mind, a thought he did not dare say aloud. He began to wonder, with growing dread, whether the woman who had just been dragged out of her own terminal by the very staff meant to serve her might now be reconsidering the deal that was supposed to save this airport altogether. The boardroom fell silent when Naomi walked in 20 minutes later, still dressed in the same wrinkled blazer she had worn at the gate, carrying the same worn leather bag, her presence somehow filling the room more completely than any tailored suit could have managed. Helen rose immediately, extending a hand in greeting, her expression a careful mixture of professionalism and barely concealed anxiety, while the rest of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, most of them already aware, through hushed phone calls and nervous glances, that something had gone badly wrong that morning. Richard took his seat at the far end of the table, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the quiet dread of a man who suspected he was about to watch a deal collapse in front of his eyes. Naomi did not open with accusations. She opened with data, sliding a folder across the table that contained a full breakdown of Ashford's customer service metrics over the past 3 years, complaint volumes broken down by category, average resolution times, and a pattern that had clearly been building long before this morning's incident. She spoke without raising her voice, walking the room through statistics, showing that verification procedures at the private terminal had failed to follow protocol in nearly 1 out of every 12 documented incidents, a number far higher than industry standard, and that complaints involving assumptions about a traveler's identity or credibility based on appearance had risen steadily over the past 2 years without any corrective action from leadership. She pulled up the security footage from that morning on the boardroom screen, letting it play in full, silent and unedited, while the executives around the table watched themselves witness, in real time, exactly the failure she had just described in numbers. One of the board members, an older man who had served on Halcyon's investment committee for nearly 15 years, cleared his throat and attempted to frame the morning's incident as an isolated failure of judgment, an unfortunate exception rather than a pattern. But Naomi calmly redirected him to a second chart, showing complaint trends stretching back 36 months, each spike correlating with periods when staffing shortages had forced supervisors to skip mandatory training sessions in favor of covering shifts. She explained, patiently and without condescension, that isolated incidents rarely existed in a vacuum, that they were almost always symptoms of a deeper structural gap, and that treating this morning as a one-time embarrassment rather than a warning sign would guarantee its repetition with some other traveler on some other morning. She did not mention Lisa or Daniel by name. She did not turn the moment into a personal grievance, though everyone in the room understood precisely what they were watching and precisely who bore responsibility for it. Instead, she spoke about systems, about how a single untrained gate agent and an overconfident security lead had been permitted to operate without any meaningful checks, about how an airport that wanted Sengre, and rate quote, and Rada, and Raycas, and Rata, and Radas, Sengre, demanding industry, could not afford to let human bias substitute for verified procedure. The room stayed silent through nearly all of it, the kind of silence that comes not from boredom, but from the uncomfortable recognition of truth. Helen glanced occasionally at Richard, whose hands remained folded tightly in his lap, his expression frozen somewhere between shame and fear of what was coming next. When Naomi finished her presentation, she closed the folder in front of her, looked around the table at each board member in turn, and said quietly that she had originally come to Ashford, intending to negotiate a partial stake. The arrangement Halcyon Capital had proposed months earlier as a way to keep some ownership while securing new investment. Richard's stomach dropped, certain the next sentence would announce the deal's collapse. Instead, Naomi said she had changed her mind entirely, and that she now wanted to purchase the airport outright, in full, with no partial arrangements and no shared ownership structure remaining in place. Helen blinked, momentarily too stunned to respond, before recovering enough to confirm, in a voice that wavered only slightly, that Halcyon Capital would welcome a full acquisition, and that the fund's board had already authorized her to negotiate exactly such a deal if the opportunity arose. Richard sat frozen at the far end of the table, watching the number appear on the projector screen as Naomi's legal team, patched in remotely within minutes, confirmed a final valuation exceeding $2.4 billion for full ownership of the airport and its surrounding infrastructure. Papers were drawn up with startling speed, lawyers on both sides working through the details that had, in truth, already been 90% negotiated over the preceding months, leaving only signatures and formal transfer documents to finalize. Naomi signed her name at the bottom of the final page without hesitation, her handwriting steady, despite everything that had happened only hours earlier. And just like that, in a matter of minutes, ownership of Ashford International passed entirely into her hands. Helen exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks, extending her hand once more, this time not out of nervous formality but genuine relief, while Richard sat quietly at the far end of the table, watching a deal he had feared was lost, only hours earlier transform instead into the largest transaction of his professional career, though the weight in his chest told him the hardest conversations were still ahead of him. Word of the transaction spread through the executive offices long before it reached the terminal floor, but down at the private gate, Daniel and Lisa remained entirely unaware that the woman they had humiliated that morning now controlled every badge, every contract, and every job in the building around them. Lisa spent part of her afternoon telling coworkers a slightly exaggerated version of the incident, framing herself as the vigilant employee who had nearly stopped a dangerous impersonation attempt, while Daniel filed his incident report with the same confident language he always used, certain that his instincts had once again protected the airport from a threat. Neither of them noticed the flurry of executive activity happening in the towers above them, nor the quiet phone calls being made to human resources, nor the memo already being drafted for a full staff meeting scheduled for the following morning. Behind the scenes, the transition team worked through the night, cross-referencing personnel files, reviewing department budgets, and preparing a full operational assessment that Naomi had requested be ready before she addressed the staff directly. She insisted on reading every complaint log herself, rather than relying solely on the summarized version prepared by her analysts. And by 2 a.m, she had highlighted dozens of individual incidents stretching back years, many of them eerily similar in pattern to what had happened to her that same morning. Travelers dismissed, questioned, or delayed based on nothing more than a hurried glance and an unexamined assumption. By early evening, every employee at Ashford International had received the same message. A mandatory meeting, called for 7 o'clock the next morning, in the main terminal hall, no explanation given beyond the words leadership transition, words that spread through the staff group chats and break rooms with a mixture of curiosity and low-grade anxiety. Lisa assumed it was simply the formal announcement of the sale everyone already knew was coming. Some ceremonial handshake between old ownership and new investors, the kind of event she expected to sit through half listening while checking her phone. Daniel assumed much the same, though he privately hoped the new owners might finally approve the expanded security budget he had been requesting for over a year, convinced his firm handling of that morning's incident had only strengthened his case. The following morning, the terminal hall was packed wall to wall, with employees pulled from every department, ticketing agents and baggage handlers, maintenance crews and gate staff, all gathered beneath the same soaring glass ceiling that framed the tarmac beyond. Richard stood at a small podium near the front, visibly nervous, clearing his throat twice before finally speaking, announcing to the assembled staff that Ashford International had officially been acquired in full by Carter Meridian Group, and that its founder wished to address the team personally. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd as heads turned, expecting some unfamiliar executive to step forward from the wings, someone in a sharp suit and polished shoes, the kind of person the room had been trained to expect in moments like this. Instead, Naomi Carter walked out from a side hallway wearing the same simple blazer, and the moment her face came into view, the murmur in the crowd sharpened into something closer to shock. Lisa, standing near the back with a coffee cup halfway to her lips, froze completely, her mind refusing for several long seconds to accept what her eyes were telling her. Daniel, positioned near the security checkpoint at the edge of the hall, felt his stomach drop as recognition hit him like a physical blow, the confident certainty that had carried him through yesterday's incident evaporating in an instant. Several employees near the front, the same ones who had stood in that terminal the previous morning watching the scene unfold, began exchanging uneasy glances, the memory of yesterday's video suddenly resurfacing with painful clarity. A baggage handler near the side wall who had witnessed the entire incident the previous day leaned toward his coworker and whispered that he had known something felt wrong about the way Lisa and Daniel had handled the situation, though he admitted quietly that he had said nothing at the time because it was not his place to interfere. Other employees exchanged similar glances, some ashamed of their own silence, others simply stunned by the scale of what had unfolded in less than a single day. An unknown traveler transformed overnight into the sole owner of the building they were all standing inside. The room grew tense, the earlier curiosity curdling into something closer to dread, as everyone present slowly connected the woman on stage to the woman who had been publicly removed from her own gate less than 24 hours earlier. Naomi accepted a small handheld microphone from Richard, held it for a moment without speaking, and let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the room to settle around her. She began by telling the assembled staff a story that had nothing directly to do with Ashford International, a memory from nearly 20 years earlier when she had walked into a bank wearing work clothes still dusty from a maintenance shift, trying to secure a small business loan to buy her very first cargo plane, only to be quietly redirected to a teller line meant for cashing checks because the loan officer had taken one look at her and decided she did not belong in his office. She spoke without bitterness, her voice steady and measured, explaining that prejudice rarely announces itself loudly, that it usually begins with a quiet assumption, a small mental shortcut people take before they have gathered any real information at all. She reminded the room that such assumptions were not reserved for any single group of people, that anyone standing in that hall could become the target of a snap judgment on any given day, based on how they were dressed, how tired they looked, or how unfamiliar their presence felt to someone who had grown too comfortable with narrow expectations. She went on to describe a second memory, one she said she had never shared publicly before, from a time years later when her company was already thriving, when a hotel concierge had once assumed she worked in housekeeping, simply because she was standing near a laundry cart in the lobby, waiting for a colleague. She had corrected him politely that day, she said, the same way she corrected Lisa and Daniel the previous morning, not out of anger, but out of a quiet insistence that people be given the chance to see her clearly, rather than through the shortcuts their minds had already built for them. She told the room that the goal was never to punish every person who made a wrong assumption, because assumptions were a natural, if flawed, part of how human minds tried to make sense of a complicated world in a matter of seconds. The goal, she said, was to build systems sturdy enough that a single flawed assumption could never again escalate into a public humiliation, a system where verification replaced guesswork long before judgment had the chance to cause harm. She paused, looked slowly across the sea of faces in front of her, and said that a truly excellent airport was not measured by the size of its terminal or the luxury of its lounges, but by whether every single traveler who walked through its doors, regardless of appearance, wealth, or background, was treated with the same basic dignity. The room stayed utterly silent as she spoke those words, and when she finished, a slow ripple of applause began somewhere near the back and spread forward until the entire hall was on its feet, employees clapping not out of obligation but out of something that felt, for many of them, uncomfortably close to recognition of their own quiet biases, finally being named aloud. When the applause faded, Naomi raised a hand slightly, signaling that she had more to say, and the room settled again into attentive silence, sensing that whatever came next would shape the direction of their jobs and their airport for years to come. She did not announce mass layoffs, and the collective tension in the room seemed to ease slightly at that. Instead, she outlined a series of changes she intended to implement immediately, beginning with the two employees most directly involved in yesterday's incident. Lisa Monroe would be suspended from active duty for a period of retraining, required to complete a comprehensive program on verification procedures and customer treatment standards before returning to any customer-facing role. Her position held open, but her judgment no longer trusted without oversight. Daniel Brooks would be reassigned away from frontline security leadership to a position focused entirely on internal training and procedural compliance, a role that would force him to study, in detail, the very failures his instincts had produced. Neither would lose their livelihood, Naomi explained, because she believed people could grow when given structure and accountability rather than simple punishment, but neither would be allowed to continue operating exactly as they had before. She explained that she had chosen this path deliberately, after reflecting through the night on what kind of leader she wanted to be, in a moment when she had every justification to respond with anger instead. Firing 2 employees would have felt satisfying for perhaps a single afternoon, she admitted, but it would have solved nothing structural, would have left the same untrained systems in place for the next unlucky traveler who happened to look unfamiliar to whoever was working the gate that day. Real change, she told the room, required rebuilding the foundation rather than simply replacing the people standing on top of it. Beyond those 2 individuals, she announced a complete overhaul of the airport's verification systems, replacing outdated manual checks with an integrated identity confirmation platform that cross-referenced flight authorizations against a live ownership database within seconds, removing the need for any employee to rely on personal judgment about who looked credible and who did not. She introduced mandatory bias awareness training for every staff member with public-facing responsibilities, not as a one-time seminar, but as an ongoing program revisited quarterly, paired with new artificial intelligence monitoring tools installed at every gate to flag unusual disputes in real time and route them automatically to a senior supervisor rather than leaving resolution to a single employee's discretion. She established an entirely new customer experience division, staffed by people specifically trained in de-escalation and fairness, tasked with reviewing every disputed incident within 24 hours. Finally, she announced an independent reporting hotline, separate from internal management, where any employee or traveler could report mistreatment without fear of retaliation, a system reviewed personally by a small oversight committee reporting directly to her office. News of the acquisition and the sweeping changes that followed spread quickly beyond the airport itself, local business journals and industry newsletters picking up the story within days, framing it less as a scandal and more as a case study in accountability. A rare example of a leader turning public humiliation into structural reform rather than private retaliation. Several industry analysts noted that most executives in Naomi's position would have handled the incident quietly, settling any potential embarrassment behind closed doors and issuing a brief, carefully worded statement designed to make the story disappear as quickly as possible. Instead, by rebuilding the airport's systems publicly and transparently, she had turned what could have been a damaging scandal into a widely cited example of accountable leadership, one that other airport executives began studying and, in several cases, attempting to replicate within their own struggling facilities. Naomi gave no interviews about the incident itself, declining every request from reporters eager to hear her side of the story in dramatic detail, choosing instead to let the airport's changing performance numbers speak for themselves over the months that followed. In the months that followed the announcement, the changes rolled out with the same discipline Naomi had applied to every business she had ever built. Consultants, specializing in operational fairness, were brought in to redesign the verification workflow from the ground up, replacing the old system of clipboards and hurried phone calls with a streamlined digital interface that pulled ownership and authorization records instantly, displaying clear confirmation on a screen visible to both the employee and the traveler, removing the private judgment call that had caused so much damage in the first place. Training sessions ran continuously for weeks, not as a single afternoon seminar people forgot within days, but as a rotating program woven into every employee's monthly schedule, reinforced through real scenarios drawn directly from the airport's own incident history, rather than generic textbook examples that felt disconnected from daily reality. Supervisors were evaluated not only on efficiency metrics, but on documented fairness outcomes, a new performance category that some longtime managers grumbled about privately, before gradually coming to see its value as complaint numbers began to fall month after month. Several department heads who had initially resisted the changes, viewing them as unnecessary overhead in an already demanding operational schedule, found themselves quietly reversing their opinions once they noticed how much smoother daily operations became. Once disputes were resolved through clear procedure, rather than improvised judgment calls made under pressure. Even the maintenance and ground crew teams, who rarely interacted directly with the public, were folded into the broader cultural shift, attending shortened versions of the same training so that the entire workforce, not just the customer-facing staff, understood the reasoning behind the airport's new direction. A year passed, and Ashford International looked, in almost every measurable way, like a different institution entirely. Customer satisfaction scores, once buried near the bottom of national rankings, climbed steadily until the airport was recognized by an independent travel association as one of the top-rated private and commercial hubs in the region, praised specifically for its verification transparency and staff professionalism. Passenger volume increased by nearly 30% as word spread among frequent travelers that Ashford had become a place where disputes were resolved fairly and quickly rather than escalated by assumption. Every employee, from baggage handlers to gate agents, had completed the new training programs, and internal surveys showed a marked increase in staff confidence when it came to handling unusual or unfamiliar situations without defaulting to snap judgment. The independent reporting hotline, once viewed with skepticism by staff who assumed it existed mainly for public relations purposes, had processed hundreds of tips over the year, the vast majority resolved through simple coaching conversations rather than disciplinary action, a pattern that reinforced Naomi's belief that most workplace failures stemmed from poor training rather than malicious intent. Richard, still serving as chief executive under the new ownership structure, later admitted to colleagues that the transformation had renewed his own sense of purpose after years of feeling trapped by a board more interested in short-term cost-cutting than long-term service quality. Daniel Brooks approached Naomi personally during one of her routine site visits, waiting until the small entourage of executives around her had dispersed before stepping forward. His posture noticeably different from the confident, dismissive man who had ordered her removal a year earlier. He apologized without excuses, telling her plainly that the months spent studying the very failures his own judgment had caused had forced him to confront assumptions he had carried for most of his career without ever examining them closely, and that he was grateful, in a way he still found difficult to articulate, for the chance to correct course instead of simply losing his job. He admitted that for years he had believed his experience made him a reliable judge of character within seconds, a skill he had once taken pride in, and that only after being forced to review case after case of his own department's mistakes had he understood how often that supposed skill had simply been bias wearing the disguise of instinct. Naomi listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she thanked him for the honesty and told him that growth mattered more to her than perfection, a sentiment she repeated a short while later when Lisa, now working in a revised customer relations role, approached her with a similar apology, her earlier arrogance replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful manner, shaped by months of retraining and reflection. Lisa confided that the hardest part of the retraining program had not been the procedural material, but the exercise where she was asked to sit and review the footage of herself from that morning, watching her own dismissive smile and hearing her own words played back to her from the perspective of a stranger, an experience she described as more humbling than any reprimand a supervisor could have delivered directly. Naomi accepted both apologies with the same calm grace she had shown throughout the entire ordeal, telling each of them, in slightly different words, that she had not purchased an airport simply to win an argument or settle a personal score, but because she believed institutions could be rebuilt to treat people better, and that watching two individuals genuinely change was, in its own way, more satisfying than any apology delivered in that first chaotic hour ever could have been. Later that afternoon, she walked alone toward the same private terminal where the entire story had begun, her reflection catching briefly in the glass before she stepped through the doors, everything around her now humming with the same quiet efficiency she had once feared, existed only on paper. She watched through the wide windows as the Gulf Stream, freshly serviced and gleaming under the afternoon sun, taxied down the runway before lifting smoothly into the open sky, carrying nothing more urgent than the next scheduled flight on a route that no longer needed her personal oversight to run correctly. A small, satisfied smile crossed her face as she watched it climb higher, the terminal around her, finally functioning the way she had always believed an airport should function, not through wealth or intimidation, but through fairness, applied consistently to everyone who walked through its doors. She thought briefly of the young woman she had once been, standing in that bank lobby nearly 2 decades earlier, uncertain whether anyone would ever take her seriously enough to give her the chance she needed, and she wondered how many other people were standing in similar lobbies and terminals at that very moment, waiting for someone to look past the surface and finally see them clearly. It was a thought she carried with her often, one that had shaped nearly every decision she made as her company grew, and one she suspected would continue guiding her long after Ashford International became just one success story among many others she still intended to build. Status could make people bow their heads out of respect, but true respect, the kind that outlasted any title or bank account, only appeared once people learned to see one another clearly, long before they ever noticed what someone was wearing.